It's always a delight to speak at Villanova. I feel I'm always guaranteed an audience that's both knowledgeable and open-minded, which is pretty much ideal. I have to start with an admission, however. I had already decided on the title of my talk that Kevin's just given you and submitted it to him when a colleague and friend, Mark Vesey, who also has his own connections with Villanova, reminded me of a pregnant sentence from the grandfather of our discipline, Peter Bryn. It comes in the first chapter of his 1978 book, The Making of Late Antiquity. This was, as he describes it, my first real engagement with the pre-Constantinian world. That's in a personal communication, just last week, actually. And it begins with the indelible line, "I wish that I had been one of the 7 sleepers at Ephesus." The point being that they fell asleep, or more accurately, were walled up in the middle of the 3rd century and didn't emerge until the early 5th century, which is exactly the period whose radical shift in cultural dynamics Bryn was trying to capture. However, that sentence about the 7 sleepers is not the pregnant sentence I'm referring to. This one occurs on page 10 of the book, and it says, I quote, "We must at all costs avoid doing the feeling for late antique men." So with that in mind, I embark on my reflections on Augustine, feelings, and feeling for Augustine. Well, of course, Bryn is making a really important point, as well, I think, as a slightly mischievous one about the earnestness of his peers. He's arguing that we should not impute to our subjects of study a notional solemnity and an impassioned religiosity that we would be loath to ascribe to ourselves. We should try not to freight their every action and word with awareness of, and I capitalize, a great cultural turning point. Peter Bryn writes, quote, "I would wish to plead that the modern scholar should at least begin his study of late antique men by setting aside holy dread." But what about other feelings, I ask? Should we set them aside? Can we set them aside? At the moment, as Kevin just mentioned, I am writing a book about Augustine as an African. While I was planning this book, I thought it was going to be rather an intellectualizing account of key moments in Augustine's life, the moments that would prove to be pressure points where the effect of Augustine's Africanness on his thought, his choices, the theology he developed, and the heresies he deplored might be felt. Last year, when I actually started writing this book, I realized it was going to be a new biography. Like we need another one, but nonetheless, it's coming. The Africanness of Augustine, I realized, was never not relevant to how he moved through the world, to the people he encountered, and the modes in which he encountered them. But how I came to that realization was precisely by feeling for Augustine. I started the book by performing a rereading of the Confessions, in which I strived all the time, sometimes successfully, not to be mesmerized by the beauty of the language and the poignancy of the thought, but to ask myself, where was Augustine when he wrote this? Certainly, where in location? When he walked out into the streets, what did he see? What did he hear? Whom did he meet? And did he find it easy to talk to them? But I was also asking, Where was Augustine in terms of his emotions? As he began to write, or more probably to dictate the Confessions, soon after he was made bishop, was he feeling secure, hopeful, optimistic? Or was he feeling anxious and scattered, dislocated and bereft, uncertain of the future, trying to make sense of his life so far and the direction it had taken? By reading the Confessions, while trying constantly to feel for Augustine, I felt the work anew. And I noticed angles and asides that I'd never noticed before. The textures of Augustine's life were revealed afresh, whether he was playing football with his brother in the dusty courtyard of their little villa in Thagaste, or hurrying through the crowded streets of Milan with his little posse of North African friends. Is it possible to avoid doing the feeling for late antique men? And why should it be desirable to do so? I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture exploring the importance of feeling for Augustine, and the ambiguity of that sentence is completely intentional. Feeling was important for Augustine, and we need to feel for him too. I am going to begin in what a few months ago I would have thought the most unlikely of places, in the transcripts of the Council of Carthage. The council to which I'm referring was convened on June the 1st, 411 CE, in the vast space of the Gargilian baths in Carthage. It was the product of years of lobbying the imperial court for a binding denunciation and condemnation of the schismatic African church that Augustine called the Pars Donati, the Donatist faction. It was the most peculiar moment to press such an issue, if you think about it. After all, Rome had fallen to Alaric and his forces less than a year before, in August 410, and the Emperor Honorius might be presumed to have been otherwise occupied. Nevertheless, towards the end of 410, he duly issued this long-desired edict calling for a council and dispatched an emissary, Marcellinus, to oversee the hearings. Lest the business should take up too much more of the emperor's time, however, he preempted the final decision by declaring the Pars Donati to be heretics in the text of the decree. So the Donatists, I'll switch now to the more convenient name that Augustine gave them. They, of course, simply called themselves Christians. The Donatists were in an impossible situation. They had been summoned to a council by imperial authority. They were obliged to attend, or they would be in contempt of court. But they already knew that the case had been decided against them. They opted for a mass showing that included a ceremonious parade of bishops into Carthage just before the council was set to begin. And the proceedings of the council itself show that they engaged in an extraordinary and courageous theatre of resistance throughout the 3 days of discussion. We know this because the transcript of the greater part of those 3 days survives. Marcellinus knew that he was presiding over a kangaroo court, but he did his best to preserve even-handed procedure and the courtesies of a proper record. Accordingly, every single word spoken at the council was recorded by a team of stenographers. It was then transcribed and submitted for approval to each of the speakers. There were 7 designated spokesmen on each side, and they would then sign off on each intervention with a confirmation that these were indeed their own words. Needless to say, the 3 days of the Council of Carthage are not consecutive. It took real time to gather these records and to get them signed off on. Nonetheless, the whole thing took place in the course of June 411. Sometimes these speakers could not refrain from inserting a caustic comment. But mostly they just wrote their name and recognovi. I've reviewed this. I was writing a chapter on Augustine and the Donatists earlier this year, and I reluctantly realized that I was going to have to read the proceedings of the Council of Carthage. Bryn, as you may know, gives this wonderful blow-by-blow account of the event in his book, Sacred Violence. But I really did need to examine the thing for myself. So I opened the relevant volume of Corpus Scriptorum Ecclesiasticorum Latinorum without enthusiasm, and I was completely hooked. The Gesta Concilii Carthaginiensis turned out to be absolutely riveting reading. Talk about feeling for late antique men. Presumably because of the verbatim transcription, all these characters about whom I had been reading for so long in other late antique texts, Marcellinus, Aurelius, Alypius, Petilian, Augustine himself, all the rest, jumped off the page as utterly recognizable and not always admirable three-dimensional figures. It was the most extraordinary sensation, a reading experience like few others. Even in the midst of this magnificent clash of personalities, and remember, distinguished bishops on both sides of this encounter had known each other and been sparring together for years by this time. Some of them had even changed from one side to the other. Even in the midst of all this, one particular episode stood out. It occurs on the third day of the proceedings, towards the end of our surviving transcript. Augustine, who had been quite quiet early on in the proceedings, is showing, I'm afraid, a tendency to long-windedness. And Marcellinus, presiding, has just pressed him to answer a question on, quote, whether you would say that Caecilian, who was the originator of the division with Donatus, was your father or your mother. And this is, of course, metaphorically speaking, the division with Donatism was all about the line of spiritual succession through ordination and baptism. Augustine is beginning rather diffusely to speak on who he considers to be his spiritual forebears when Petilian, the leader of the opposing side, interrupts with no preamble. Who ordained you to be bishop? Petilian's colleague, Montanus, adds a request for elucidation of Paul's phrase, I have fathered you in Christ through the gospel, 1 Corinthians 4:15. I suspect he adds this with a sneer because the room erupts, or rather the baths erupt. And Augustine's friend Alypius says, put this uproar on the record. Augustine plays for time with a speech about the different ways in which the words father and brother are used. Petilian repeats his blunt question. Augustine's colleagues, Placidius, his later biographer, and his friend Alypius, circle and try blocking tactics. It's all in the transcript. Petilian's question is echoed by one of his own colleagues. Augustine begins, I think the inquiry is irrelevant. But he's interrupted by Marcellinus. Kindly answer the question. Augustine finally says, this is an extended quotation, I think the inquiry from our brothers, obviously a barbed choice of word, on the opposite side is irrelevant. And I'm not refusing a response to these irrelevancies. You're asking who ordained me. I am a Christian. I am a man of faith, to which God is my witness. I am a Catholic. And we're still bickering about who should rightly be called by that name. I'm defending that church. I'll assert that in any way you please. Whatever I am, what I'm in is the church. I see where you're going. You're chasing up human slanders. The stuff you're slinging around is already familiar to our ears and hearts. Finally, he gets to the point. Megalius, the primate of the Catholic Church of Numidia, ordained me when he was available to do so. See, I've answered. Go ahead, bring out your dossier. There too, it will be clear you're making slanderous claims. End of quote. Yeah, phew. Marcellinus does not say phew. He calmly acknowledges this response. He reiterates the need to make such responses, although, he adds, ad hominem charges, the quaede personi seguntur, ought not to obstruct the proceedings. Now, anyone who has ever been in a fractious and divided committee meeting, which I'm sure is no one here, will flinch at the passive aggression, the temporizing, the power plays going on in this section of the transcript. And it's an extreme version, a sort of accentuated version of what's going on throughout. Petillion is pressing on a really sore point. Knowing that his cause is already lost, he can at least remind his chief opponent and anyone present, or, as we now know, reading the proceedings subsequently, of the painful fact that Megalius had ordained Augustine as coadjutant bishop only belatedly and with reluctance. It seems, in fact, that a letter from Megalius protesting the ordination had circulated for years through the African church. No doubt it was gleefully copied and passed on by everyone who opposed Augustine. Quite a few people. Megalius is almost entirely absent from the Augustinian corpus. He's not in the Augustinus lexicon. He's not in the Oxford Guide to the Historical Reception of Augustine. I'm sorry, Alan, I didn't check your dictionary, but your encyclopedia, but I don't think he's there either. You can correct me. In fact, it was only when Petillion posed his provocative question, or rather when I read the transcript of Petillion posing his question, that I realized I've been working on Augustine for years. I had no idea who had ordained Augustine. I knew the ordination was somewhat irregular. I knew it was advertised and supported by a flurry of letters between luminaries of the Roman Church, but I did not know how it had actually been realized and by whom. Augustine knew, though, and Petillion knew, and everyone at the Council of Carthage knew, or Augustine's supporters would not have been so defensive and Petillion's so persistent. Augustine's own summary of the Council of Carthage, which is a pretty even-handed summary, actually, the Breviculus Collationis, reads as follows for this specific episode. They asked who ordained Augustine, preparing some slanders to hurl. Although he fearlessly responded to them that he was ordained by Megalius, who was then the primate of the bishops of the Catholic Church in Numidia, and pressed them urgently to bring out what they had prepared, so that there too they might be proved slanderous, they wrenched away their focus to something else. The slanting of this particular account is almost all in the adverbs. Augustine responded fearlessly, intrepide, is the word. He pressed them urgently, instanter. But what on earth was to be feared for someone participating in a show trial that had already been decided in his favor? And is urgently the right word for what the transcript itself denotes? The extent of the conversation. Or is it in a spirit of angry defiance that Augustine asks his opponents to bring out further materials? The only other place where Megalius' name crops up in Augustine's writings is in a letter composed only a couple of years after he was ordained. That's letter 38. It's addressed to a monk called Profuturus, who seems to have been an intimate. Augustine describes him in the first paragraph in classicizing terms of friendship as another self, alter ego, and laments that he himself is at present, in some detail actually, that he himself is at present confined to bed in excruciating pain from hemorrhoids. The second paragraph, however, introduces a new subject. Okay, who would doubt that you've already heard that old Megalius is dead? Senex Megalius. Megalius, he tells Professors, had been buried 24 days earlier. Augustine is curious to know who will succeed him. And then, immediately after, the letter changes gear. Augustine writes, in the midst of all this, how careful one has to be to prevent hatred taking hold of one's inmost heart and not allowing us to pray to God in our own chamber with the door closed. On the contrary, my dearest brother, you know that hatred closes the door against God himself. It creeps in when someone's angry, for no one sees the injustice of his own anger. And once anger gets established, it becomes hatred. When we receive unknown guests, we generally say that it's much better to put up with someone bad than to risk unwittingly excluding the good while we're protecting against the bad. But with the emotions, affectibus animi, it's the opposite. It's incomparably more healthy not to open up the heart to anger, even when a just anger is trying to get in, than to admit it when it won't readily go away and will travel from the foundations to the roof beam. Anger grows shamelessly and more quickly than you would think. The paragraph closes with an appeal to an earlier intimate conversation between Augustine and Professors. He writes, you certainly realize with what anxiety and concern I've written these things, if you recall our recent conversation on a certain journey, a conversation about which we know no more. Trying to feel for Augustine as I write my biography, one of the things I've come to suspect is that the emotions Augustine grappled with most painfully and most consequentially are often the ones we hear least about. One of these, I think, is his grief at the death of his son Adeodatus, which precipitated a turning point in Augustine's life, and Jim Wetzel's helped me to see that. And here we pick up the hint of another one. Augustine could not hear about the death of the man who had opposed his ordination, who had, so he clearly felt, doubted and insulted him, without reflecting on anger and its propensity to turn into hatred. 14 years later, at the Council of Carthage, Augustine's opponents knew that an allusion to his ordination would be a certain way to hurt him and to put him on the defensive. I suspect that all his life, Augustine grappled with the emotion of anger, that he knew it was a weakness. He knew it would squander his energies and lead him astray, but also that it was a powerful, if dangerous, motivator. Augustine was an eager student of Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, the philosophical dialogue in which Cicero examines the emotions. Apposite quotes from all 5 books of that work occur in Augustine's writings throughout his life. In general, he disagrees with Cicero's division of emotions into categories of good and bad. Emotions, says Augustine, are not inherently good or bad, but gain their moral properties from the context in which they are experienced and used. But there is something qualitatively different about anger. In the City of God, Augustine uses Cicero's own definition of anger, that it is the lust for revenge, ulcis cendi libido. Cicero argues powerfully against the notion that anger is in any way a useful emotion. It is much too close, he says, to insanity. Even on the battlefield, anger is a liability rather than a stimulus to courage. And then Cicero asks, and what about that warfaring anger when it comes home? How does it behave with a wife, with children, with the whole household? Is it useful then? Fantastic question. I think this would have struck a deep chord with Augustine. He was so aware, so argued, many other places. He was so aware of human interconnectedness, of households, cities, communities, and their obligations one to another. The whole notion of the city of God here on earth was developed as a paradigm of human interconnectedness. The way in which anger could endanger those obligations or rupture them entirely would have terrified him. Remember, he said, anger grows shamelessly in prudenter and more quickly than you would think. And over time, it develops into hatred. Anger is a break in the self, a breaking of the self that damages the self's moral outlook and lets in the far more terrible emotion of hatred. Augustine sees that very clearly, and he struggles perpetually against being broken by anger. He knows that anger is a condition of fallen humanity. The philosopher Agnès Callard published a perceptive and iconoclastic essay entitled On Anger in the Boston Review Forum series. Great series, if you haven't come across it. And then someone writes a provocative essay, and then a lot of people from, as it were, all levels of academia write responses, engage with it in different ways. Part of Callard's conclusion is that theorists of anger pretend that they can hold themselves aloof from the emotion. She says if only Nietzsche, Foucault, Girard, and the rest, René Girard, would step inside their own theories, they would draw the simple, devastating conclusion that we are all implicated all the time. She ends her essay, we can't be good in a bad world. How much immorality, Callard asks earlier in the essay, should we permit ourselves? The realistic project of inhibiting anger must be distinguished from the idle fantasy of purifying it. And she argues, and I think she's right, that anger theorists have indulged that idle fantasy of purification of anger. This is an idle fantasy that Augustine does not indulge. His preoccupation in the letter to Profotoros is with the attempt not to let in anger in the first place. He knows what damage it can do once it's there. The proceedings of the Council of Carthage show that once in, he could not let it go. He was momentarily undone by its resurgence, however much his friends tried to cover for him. Why did he use that adverb fearlessly or untremblingly, intrepide, to gloss his own response in the Breviculus? I suggest it was because he felt the shaking, the trembling of his anger all over again, and he wanted to write it out of the record, little realizing that in trying to write it out, he was revealing that instant of passion. Building to her conclusion, Callard writes, everyone assumes that we can retain the moral side of anger, of righteous anger, while distancing ourselves from paradigmatically irrational phenomena, such as grudges and vengeance. But what if this is not the case? Close quote. Augustine was not everyone, the everyone of that sentence. The person who had absorbed the Ciceronian definition of anger as the lust for vengeance was not going to be so easily misled into thinking that anger could be so wholly moral, or possibly moral at all. This is incredibly illuminating when we come to consider what Augustine writes about God's anger. Theologically, he's presented with a problem. The Hebrew scriptures frequently make reference to the anger of God. Augustine realizes all too clearly the vexed moral status of anger and its fundamental irrationality. How then, in the purity of God's goodness and reason, could God possibly feel anger? God is impassible, does not change. Anger is an extreme turbulence of spirit, a change in physical state, a change in mental state. Augustine is at pains to try to resolve this problem. Here, next little bit, I'm stealing from the entry on era in Augustinus' lexicon. I hope you'll forgive me, because I actually wrote it a long time ago, and I never knew it would come to be so relevant today. And incidentally, I've slightly changed my mind. So there we are. So, as I observed in Book 9 of the City of God, Augustine talks about how angels can punish the deserving, those who deserve punishment, without actually feeling anger, and help the endangered without feeling fear. And then he explains, even so, we appropriate those names of the passions to the angels through the habit of human speech, because of a sort of similarity of activities, not because of some weakness of feeling on their part. Just as, according to the scriptures, God himself feels angry, and yet he is not disturbed by any passion. The effect of vengeance has appropriated the word, not its turbulent affect. So the effect of vengeance has appropriated the word anger, not its turbulent affect. It's only through the inadequacy of post-lapsarian human language that we seem to impute anger to God. In point of fact, we're naming a feeling in ourselves. When we feel that we're being punished, we feel as if God is angry with us. But this cannot be so. Not only is God impassible, God has disposed all things justly. And as Augustine wrote when he was struggling with his own feelings after the death of Megalius, no one sees the injustice of his own anger. The profound disorder of losing sight of justice, the disorder that is inherent to anger, is simply unthinkable for God. Augustine elaborates more fully on this when he preaches in the Enarrationes on Psalm 2, verse 5. That's tunc loquetur ad eos in ira sua et in furore suo conturbabit eos. Then he'll speak to them in his anger and he will confound them in his rage. Augustine preaches the anger and rage of God ought not to be understood as a disturbance of mind, but the power by which he punishes with complete justice. The anger of God is actually an emotion which arises in a mind that knows the law of God when it sees that same law passed over by a sinner. Through this emotion of just minds, many things are punished. You might think that this is a troubling amount of power to those humans who are convinced that their own minds are just and they are fully cognizant of the law of God. Augustine doesn't usually grant this much to flawed human judgment, but he adds more subtly a concession, although the anger of God could also be rightly understood as that darkening of the mind which engulfs people who transgress the law of God. It's not that God can feel anger, it is that human judgment is deluded and human minds all too easily darkened by a buried knowledge of their own sin. It's not by chance that Augustine portrays himself as asking, in the words of the Psalms, just before the miraculous moment of Tale Lege in Confessions 8, "How long, O Lord, will you be angry with me? Please don't remember my former misdeeds." Augustine prays for the withdrawal of God's anger now, at this moment. No longer tomorrow and tomorrow, which is how that paragraph ends, crass and crass. And that's how he experiences the moment of conversion. We may think we are experiencing the anger of God when our minds are in disarray. We may feel it suddenly withdrawn. But the temporality of human anger is not so simple. It lingers. Its effects spread out and distort our other actions. Some of you may know Bruckner's Ninth Symphony in D minor, the one that was interrupted by his death. Bruckner was a profoundly religious man who made his living for a while as a church organist. Almost all his compositions, except the symphonies, are explicitly Christian in content, and they're often designed for liturgical use. I'm generally skeptical of programmatic interpretations of music, but in the extraordinary scherzo of the Ninth Symphony, I think we hear a man doubting his faith and raging against his own imminent death. If you don't know this, there's a fantastic performance by a group called Les Dissonances on YouTube. I really commend it to you. This scherzo begins delicately with a soft suspended chord in the woodwind and a quick pizzicato line on the strings, descending in minor intervals only to ascend again. The motif's repeated a little higher, growing in intensity, but still delicate. Then suddenly it's interrupted by hammer blows of repeated jagged chords fortissimo on the brass and strings. It sounds like the thrashing of desperate rage and despair. After a few bars, that delicate motif reasserts itself, but now you can't hear it in the same way. It seems tenuous and fragile, and the listening is shaped by fear that the furious fortissimo chords will reassert themselves. And indeed they do. And this, I think, is the temporality of human anger, how ungovernable it can be, and how it can shape, or rather distort, everything around it. So no wonder Augustine was so afraid of admitting it in the first place. But as I write this unnecessary biography, as I try to feel for Augustine, I realized that, like so many of us, he warned against the feelings to which he was most susceptible. To return to the circumstances of the Council of Carthage, why was the fight against the Donatists so relentlessly pursued for so long? Anger. Why did Augustine get ever more prolix and assertive as the proceedings of the council went on? Anger. And why did he write and write and write against Julian of Eclanum and Pelagianism until he, Augustine, was, like Bruckner, actually interrupted by death? Anger. I'm not saying that's the only thing, obviously. Anxiety about heresy is huge, but what is giving him the energy, particularly against Julian of Eclanum, to drive and drive on and on and on, to spend his last months in that impassioned debate? Anger was a great motivating force for Augustine, but a dangerous one, and he knew it. And that was why it was so important to him to argue so subtly and so repeatedly that it was impossible for God to feel anger. My final example from Augustine dates from well before these great battles. The letter exchange with his beloved friend Nebridius began before Augustine's return from Italy to Africa in 388 and continued thereafter until ruptured by Nebridius's death. These letters are probably the most intimate and playful things that Augustine ever wrote. You can immediately see what extraordinary charisma he had in his youth. How it could have been that an entire entourage of friends and family followed him to Italy and back to Africa again through all his passionate changes, his vicissitudes of place and mood and religious affiliation. The object of the exchange, this particular letter exchange, however, is part serious. Nebridius, the younger man, and Augustine's eager student, is peppering Augustine with questions that tremble on the threshold between philosophy and theology. In letter 9, Augustine is beginning to explain how it is that thoughts and dreams may be imparted to us. But he starts from the emotions. He writes, I think that every emotion, motum animi, has some effect on the body. And when they're more significant emotions, for example, when we're angry or sad or joyful, that effect transmits to our dull, sluggish senses. Augustine adds, if the mind has some persistent difficulty in taking action or getting what it wants, it is persistently angry. In my opinion, anger is the turbulent desire to remove things which impede ease of action. Why did the young Augustine, he was 32 or 33 when he wrote this letter, which I realize isn't young to some of you in this room, but it's young to me. Why did he go first to anger as his example of an extreme emotion that manifests in the bodily senses? He goes first to anger. Why did he define anger as the response to impediments? He gives actually the quotidian, the completely everyday example of trying to write and breaking a pen in frustration. His life to date had been filled with turbulent desire. I think in many ways his life all through was filled with turbulent desire, however much he tried to settle it. I don't think that's just a didactic reworking in the Confessions. I think it's real. When he prayed that his heart should find peace in God, freedom from anger must have been one of his principal objectives. The statement of purpose of this conference closes with the question, how does attention to the heart touch even our own scholarly ways of knowing? This paper begins to suggest an answer for me. Much has been written about love in St. Augustine. To my knowledge, very little has been written about anger in St. Augustine. Again, that ambiguity and anger in St. Augustine is intentional. Not much has been written about the theme of anger in Augustine's writings, though some attention has been paid to his complicated justification of the anger of God. And almost nothing has been written about the anger that we can pretty clearly see Augustine felt. Am I doing the feeling for this particular late antique man? Yes, of course I am. So I hope by this time I've shown that the feeling is not wholly unsubstantiated. I feel, and I use the word advisedly, this is the only way to bring a fresh angle to Augustine's well-documented biography, to follow him anew through the landscapes of North Africa and to see through his eyes the people he encountered there in all their magnificent, maddening human complexity. And yes, attention to the heart is radically changing my scholarly practice. I've always been attentive to structures of thought, both spelled out and simply assumed. That's part of what I'm doing in the Irrational Augustine. I've now become attentive to the implicit structures of emotion and feeling. This requires a richer type of reading, a fuller alertness to silence and obliquity, and, as in the letter about the death of Megalius, to the jump shifts in thought that reveal a troubled spirit. It requires reading not just the words on the page, but the posture of the body who wrote or dictated the words. And in this fuller alertness and fuller reading, I'm also more alert to myself as a reader and a scholar, to my own predilections and passions, and ideally to my own limitations as well. I see Augustine's anger through my own. I understand so well that turbulent desire to remove things which impede ease of action. See comment above about committee meetings. I also see his love. At the beginning of the final section of East Coker, the most Augustinian of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, he writes, "So here I am, in the middle way, having had 20 years largely wasted, the years of l'entre-deux-guerres, trying to learn to use words. And every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure because one has only learnt to get the better of words for the thing one no longer has to say, or the way in which one is no longer disposed to say it. And so each venture is a new beginning, a raid on the inarticulate with shabby equipment always deteriorating in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, undisciplined squads of emotion. Every attempt to use words is a wholly new start." Augustine, so aware of the fallenness of humans and the abject imperfection of their language, would know exactly what Eliot meant. Augustine spent his life trying to manage and explain the general mess of imprecision of feeling. Sometimes those undisciplined squads of emotion threatened to undo him. It is part of what makes him such an endlessly fascinating object of study. It's part of what makes me see myself as a scholar and as a person more clearly. I love feeling for Augustine.
Thank you, Catherine, so much. What a rich offering, and I'm sure we have much to talk about here. So we do have some time. I will say that if you're watching at home, if you want to send me a question through the chat, I will see if we can get to it around the edges of this conversation. But we're going to start with the business in the room here. So comments or questions for Catherine? Yes.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. It was great. And it brought me back to a seminar I took years ago. It was like a seminar on Augustine. You know, Augustine with the Donatists, and Manichaeans, Donatists, and Pelagians. And in the small seminar, one of the few moments where nearly everyone was in agreement with their disappointment in Augustine was with the Donatists. And what made me think about it, and I'm curious if this relates to it, is his definition of anger as an impediment or a response to an impediment. And whether or not Augustine was very self-aware about his rhetoric skills and how skillful he was in his sermons and writing and everything, presumably he was.
Yes.
He knew he was good at it, right? And how repeatedly it failed. He couldn't convince the Donatists to the point where he brings in the troops, right? Brings in the imperial forces. Yeah. And now as I'm listening to this great lecture, it's almost like it was an impediment, and he convinces himself it was out of love. Like if you read the letter to the officer, right?
Absolutely.
You know, yeah. But was it anger? Maybe that's why the seminar had this disappointment. Like, come on, Augustine, like, did you have to do that? Couldn't you just let it be or something? And it was a very 21st century anachronistic sort of like read of what was happening. But it certainly. So I'm wondering if that's part of this feeling for Augustine, right? Disappointment even sometimes, as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely to the point that he saw the Donatists as an impediment, and exactly, he knew how good he was. And you see him, well, you clearly know, again and again, calling the Donatists out to debate. Not surprisingly, they mostly don't respond. And his rhetoric doesn't work. Can one, but your deeper question is sort of, is it legitimate to feel disappointment in Augustine? It depends what you expect of him, I think. I think one of the, I mean, as I work on this, as I write this book and think about this book, I think one of the problems with Augustine is both he and his legacy have calcified in a certain way. And, you know, he has to be great and he has to say beautiful things. And that's partly why I said I made an effort to read the Confessions, not being mesmerized by the beauty of the language and so on. I'm as mesmerized by it as the next person. But and also, of course, once you've been working on Augustine for a while, the Confessions kind of sing in one's head. And it's hard, it's like when you've sung, you know, you sung a particular setting of a psalm or a piece of the Bible, and you hear it read aloud, and you hear that setting going alongside. But trying to restore the man who put those words one after the other, and you might infer from what I said about where he was emotionally when he wrote the Confessions, I think the motivation absolutely is he's actually feeling anxious and bereft and insecure, and he is very consciously trying to draw together the threads of his life, hence all that stuff about, you know, and I wasn't an infant anymore, now I was a boy, and how was it that I was the same person? So I'd say I don't feel disappointed in Augustine because, well, I do think he was a great man and an extraordinary thinker and endlessly fascinating. I still think he was a man and operating in the world with other human beings who occasionally enraged him. So does that answer?
Yeah, no, it does, yeah. And I think part of it is, at least, I don't know, like an undergraduate level, students are encountering the Confessions and then create this image of Augustine.
Nimbus.
I mean, a great exercise is just have them read a beautiful passage and read that letter to the general or whatever, about love and beating. He's just human. He had conflict. Yeah. Anyway,
he's a brilliant human.
Yeah,
he's human. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Boyd and then Veronica, please.
So, thank you for just a remarkable lecture. That was amazing. I have two sort of, I suppose, disparate questions. I'll just throw them out there. And as you proceeded, I just couldn't help thinking more and more about the obvious and very, both explicit and implicitly described anger of Jesus in the Gospels.
Yep.
And I just wondered, just a kind of factual question, do we have any indication of Augustine? I mean, how does Augustine treat, Jesus turning the tables in the temple or other expressions of Jesus's anger, and what does he do with them? That is just a curious question for me that I have no idea what the answer is.
It's a fantastic question. Thank you, Mawr. And I'm afraid I don't know the answer. I didn't root it out when I was writing that entry on Era. I should have looked. It didn't occur to me. I was so, at the time, and indeed to this day, I was so fascinated by the elaborateness of this explanation of the anger of God. Everyone's going to get up and walk out. I kind of forgot about Jesus. I'm sorry.
I was struck by you talked about being sensitive to the silences, you know, and it occurred to me, one of the other people that one might imagine Augustine feeling very angry at is Patricius.
Yeah.
About which he's very silent.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about Augustine's relationship with his own father and anger issues around that.
Yeah. Oh, I think here it's absolutely with Megillus, you actually have this great business of it being mapped out. Patricius, I suspect your implication is right. He was incredibly angry. I suspect that's what's at the bottom in the sort of Laudes Monicae of this completely gratuitous thing about her telling wives how to survive brutal husbands. You know, why is that? I mean, that's such an odd section of the Confessions anyway, but why is that there? The scene at the baths when he's just so put on the spot by his father in sort of self-conscious adolescence. Yes, I suspect there was incredible anger. The other, I mean, I mentioned the silence, not anger, but the silence of grief around a dead artist's death, which I think is hugely significant. And again, I can sort of tease out tiny hints from across the corpus of where that manifests. The other is, of course, sending away the woman with whom he lived for so many years. And people go on and on about how can it be so brief? How can he? Well, because that was this moment of incredibly intense feeling, possibly anger with his mother, but certainly intense feeling. I take quite seriously this description, this incredibly moving description of his heart as torn and bleeding in that moment. We hear nothing else about her, and that in itself, that silence is really significant, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
So for Veronica, please.
Yeah, those are things that I was going to ask about. I suppose they're well answered, but I suppose I was also interested in rereading the Confessions recently about how that is kind of piled on to where Augustine is with regard to the Stoics at that point in the Confessions. And it seemed to me that
which point did that moment in Book 8?
The part after he talks about the death of his son, and then he's talking about the death of Monica, and he's correcting his son for having grief, and he's really struggling with the strength of his own emotions, it seems, at that point. So I wonder if you've thought,
shut up, not to cry.
Yeah, and then he says that something like his own God was teaching him something strange. I forget what he said. It was when he had his own grief and he was noticing his own grief, God was teaching him something about punishment or something strange like that. But it wasn't like God was teaching him, humanity. Yeah, it was like you have these too strong attachments, and that's what God was teaching you to remind you that your attachments were too strong, or something along those lines.
Thank you for reminding me of that.
Sorry, but I wondered if you've connected these thoughts of his emotions and the way in which he gravitates towards Stoicism in different ways at different points in his life, and how he grapples with it.
Yeah, and I think his Stoicism is very heavily mediated through Cicero. It's not something I've specifically worked on, and this paper, as you may infer, was written completely ad hoc for this moment. It's a freestanding piece. I've always been struck by the conviction of his takedown of the Stoics, that he thinks it's absolute rubbish, that the wise man can be happy under torture. And that he spells that out really clearly. And the interesting thing, Veronica, is it Stoic self-control that he is, as it were, in intertext that with there, or is it gentlemanly self-control? I actually wonder, so yet another way of feeling for Augustine this is becoming much more attentive to issues of class. And I wonder if he feels himself failing as a Roman man of slightly ambiguous class status. And he's trying, just as, again, I'm sorry, I keep appealing to the room. Those of us who have children may be well aware that sometimes we're hard on them for things that we know are our own failings, because we don't want them to replicate what we do. And I can't help wondering whether this is also part of bringing up a Deodatus to be a particular type of Roman gentleman. And you're absolutely right, Stoicism is part of that profile. But whether it's, as it were, a philosophical position or whether it's a very personal, social position. Yeah.
So I saw Alan and then Fritz.
So I'm curious about how in the Rule of Augustine, where he's talking to the brothers he's about to leave behind, he says, when quarrels happen, put an end to them at once. And then he goes on carefully and says, because anger can grow into hatred, and anyone who hates a brother is a murderer. Which is a
bingo. Thank you. It's a fantastic intertext. Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Why would you pull that quotation out of scripture to your brothers in religion, as it were?
Right.
And yet,
and have it be expressed so extremely. Yeah.
But it's the splinter of anger becomes the beam in your own eye, and who hates a brother is a murderer. It seems to me that confirms his awareness of the extraordinary danger of anger, even within a small community.
Or possibly particularly within a small community. But indeed, thank you so much, Alan. That's a fantastic intertext. And yes, absolutely, complements the point I was trying to make. Yeah.
But two things, just briefly. I mean, the scene in the Confessions with Monica's death, it doesn't end with him, saying "Don't cry." I mean, what he comes to see is right, but that there's you're weeping and in God's presence, and that's somehow different from, say, the kind of self-dramatizing grief he had when his friend died when he was a young man. I mean, it seems like those two episodes, he seems to think there's different ways of grieving. So, but I was also thinking, I mean, I find, say, with students, the notion that anger is a deadly sin, one of the mortal sins, is a hard sell. And in particular, because they think, maybe it's because, well, anyway, at least the more principled defenses of anger they will give will be, but there are injustices that should make you angry. And if they don't, like if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. I think I've read that on bumper stickers. I mean, even someone like Aquinas will make a distinction between anger that is sinful and then kind of a righteous anger. Why do you think it is that Augustine, I mean, certainly that kind of justification for anger, not even just a justification, but a commendation of anger in certain circumstances, why do you think Augustine won't countenance that at all?
I think because for exactly the reason Alan just gestures towards, because he sees the incredible danger of it. And I would say you should send your students to this essay by Inés Callar. It's not theological at all, but the way she argues, you cannot read it and come away thinking anger is a good thing. There's another very good moment in that essay, which I thought of talking about, but it actually doesn't reflect anything I found that Augustine says, and it's the closest to the sort of justification your students are using. And she says something like, anger is a recognition that something is broken. it's not a way of fixing it. And I thought that was a very good formulation. And I would separate myself from Augustine in a way here, saying I actually do think with your students that the sort of anger that recognizes that something is broken is incredibly important. It is, as I said, a motivator, but it doesn't fix it. And I've actually never really managed to manage that type of anger. So to see a deep injustice, some people can. I think, a really accomplished activist can. But if I see something that's profoundly unjust, I don't personally seem to have much of a middle way between being absolutely helplessly enraged or just sort of gathering myself in and saying, okay, I can't deal with that. I can't confront that. And I think part of what's going on here, I don't think I'm unique in that. And part of what is going on is the recognition of how easily a recognition that something's broken can become the absolutely unproductive and damaging sort of anger.
I'm inclined to agree with you, but I find it, like I said, it's a hard sell to my.
Yeah.
Partly because I think their capacity to be angry about injustice somehow is seen as a commendation of the moral sensitivity.
Yeah.
You kind of get kudos for getting angry about that.
That's a whole extra problem.
Yeah.
Actually. Moral sensitivity doesn't correct injustice.
So in your study of God's anger, did you find him considering passages like Psalm 139, where it's the psalmist saying, I loathe those who hate you, O Lord. I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Just the less allegorizable, more straightforward. I think there's a way to look at that and say it's still, the psalmist isn't totally vindicating his own anger, but I'm curious what he does with that.
I don't remember, to be honest. And so it's Psalm 139. So I would actually be really interested to see what he does in the Narrationes. And you say this in the City of God?
It's in the City of God, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. I hated them with perfect hatred. Yeah.
And what does he do with it in the City of God?
Well, he says perfect hatred is to wish that your enemy is destroyed qua enemy, not qua person. So he ties it to the Provatio notion of evil.
Yes.
So it's that evil has to be healed. You can't cut out a wound, right? You have to heal it. Right. So,
thank you.
Right.
You both.
Good job.
That was so lovely, Catherine. Just a quick comment and then a question. One was, I know you left Jesus out of talk. I couldn't help but think about what I'm leading my students through at the moment for a course on broadly Christology, Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, which he talks about the sort of the three hounds of hell that afflict the disinherited in their state on earth. And his interpretation of Jesus, I hadn't really thought to put it in connection with Augustine, but anger is one of the hounds of hell. It just sort of consumes you. But it's a righteous, it's for a cause, for a reason. I wonder if you just briefly glanced over that. It's a fascinating connecting point. I don't know if any Thurman has any connection to Augustine whatsoever, but obviously with Jesus, they have a common connection. So I'd be curious to know, right, what if anything, comes to that. But it's a fascinating text. The thing I was going to ask is really just a general question. And I saw this in the Irrational Augustine, but just the incredible way you brought out the Cassiciacum dialogues. For me, it was a grad student at the time. I decided to try to read Augustine chronologically, and I didn't get past the dialogues, and partly because of your text. I just got enraptured with the way that you brought to life that community the language, the playfulness of Augustine, as you put it. As I'm listening to you, I hear a different kind of scholarship going on here that is still scholarly, of course, very exquisite scholarship, but it's a kind of reaching out almost from heart to heart. I mean, you're doing something that to some minds would be very dangerous, which is, I guess Brown is alluding to this, the doing the feeling, right? The imputation of feelings to these authors who are, centuries removed from us. And yet I can't help but think that this is what, for many of us, depending on whether we love our subjects in the way that I think you do, we want our students to come away with. Like, not simply to know a bunch of stuff about Augustine, but to actually connect heart to heart, if you will, and to get on the inside, if you will, of not unlike what Augustine says in Confessions 10 about those who hear my words, with love, understand what I'm saying. Is kind of, right? How can you know that I'm speaking the truth? Well, those whose hearts are on fire with charity now. It's really an unfair question, but I wonder if you could just say a word or two about this, what sounds to me like a slight change maybe in your approach to Augustine or scholarship in general, that maybe you could commend to all of us.
What I am, this is sort of power, as it were, but it's what I'm trying to document here. Is so the reason I gave, and thank you for that lovely, question, tribute, all that. Thank you. When I gave this title to Kevin, what I thought I didn't know how I was going to substantiate it, but what I thought the whole paper was going to be directly about was precisely this shift to a much more direct sort of affective reading that came as I began to try to reconstruct Augustine's Africanness and the ways in which it was significant to him. It's a huge shift. As you said, it's still, I hope, it's still grounded in really close reading of his text. That's what all my scholarship's grounded in. But it is a different way of going about things. And yes, it's what we try to impart to our students. And I find it's partly a product of age. I think, as I get older, I'm fed up with problems for problems' sake, as it were, with intellectual problems for their own sake. I always want to know, okay, what wider context does this fit in? What pattern of belief? What assumptions does it fit in? Who says this to someone? In what context? That's become incredibly important to me, and I don't think it's going away. I mean, I think my next book will be I don't think it'll be about Augustine. I think this has to be the last book about Augustine, but will be in the same vein. But I will also say again, thank you for saying heart to heart, because I think when Kevin invited me to do this, he said, well, the theme is going to be emotions or something like that. It was quite general.
Yeah.
And then I decided, I read this sensational piece from the Council of Carthage. I thought, right, that's it, anger, that's what I'm going to talk about. Then I went back to the conference website, and it was Conybeare for Corneum, and it was also irenic. Yeah. And I thought, uh-oh. Because at that time, I'm afraid I'd let the anger in, and I was it was launched there. Thank you.
So let me just interject and say, I couldn't imagine a more perfect contribution to the kind of work that we're doing here. So this was absolutely true. So let's see, I think Ty, if you had.
If there's time, yeah.
There is.
Just quickly, thank you for opening up that space to think about Augustine in a way that probably I try to avoid thinking about him. I appreciate that. One of the things that you said right toward the end of one of your answers a few minutes ago is something that I was thinking about in terms of the motivate, what lies underneath anger. And you said something about insecurity. And it struck me because a lot of his engagements with polemical engagements, of course, his whole life is marked by one after another.
Absolutely.
They all could be read as challenges to his security. the security of his ordination, the security of the good in light of the Manichaean theory of.
Yes, I think, and I didn't mention Manichaeism, but I think that's huge, that he's paranoid about that all his life and about being smeared with Manichaeism still.
And that's a spark for his anger. But what's doubly interesting, it seems to me, is that in another way, his entire moral psychology and anthropology kind of run off of insecurity. Right, his whole emphasis, sort of single-minded emphasis on humility, can at times be run on the fuel of insecurity. So in a way, it's paradoxical, right? Like I might get the gift of perseverance, and I didn't do anything to do that. But the fact that I don't know, in the order of knowing, I don't know that, actually motivates me. And I just wonder if you see anything going on there.
I mean, I think there are other ways you can frame it than insecurity. So I was talking about that specific moment of writing the Confessions, him being insecure. But I think he really is a quaestio to him.
Right,
to himself.
Yeah, he's opaque, yeah.
And he thinks it's important to be like that. I mean, he may, when he prays, for rest in God, I think what he's recognizing is that's the only way he's going to get it. He's recognizing exactly this agitation, which manifests in so many different ways. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really riveting presentation. I drove down from Boston to here, and on my way I decided, since I was alone, I would listen to the Confessions on audiobook, which was my first time, encountering it in that fashion. And I found myself, where I would previously be a little enamored, as you said, in your experience of reading the Confessions in book 1, I found myself profoundly sad. So I just find this presentation really helpful, even just for my own personal engagement with the text.
It is, parenthetically, it is sad. So I read Confessions 1 for the Villanova Confessions.
Okay.
So I recorded this thing, and at the end I was practically crying.
I had to turn it off. I was like, I have to listen to some music or something, because I can't make it all the way down past Hartford if I'm listening to all of this. But as far as my questions go, they kind of build affective ties. They're both kind of anthropologically centered. And one is just, and I apologize to the people in the beginning panel because I asked the same question to the presenters there, but what is the heart? And for you, in your reading of Augustine and trying to feel with him, where are the feelings in his anthropology? How do they relate to his psychology? I have my own thoughts about feelings and emotions, and have, thoughts about trauma studies and current psychologies, but I'd be very interested in knowing where you think those two things, if they're distinct, operate in his anthropology.
Well, you may have noticed that in not one of the quotes I gave does he use the word core or heart. So he's never talking about that. It's all about the animus, or occasionally the anima. I'm not sure I can give an answer about, so I would argue animus or anima is the seat of this particular feeling. I'm not sure I can answer your question because it would need a really, really systematic thought. And it's not something I've thought about specifically, and I don't want to botch it. So what do you think?
I have no idea.
Oh, I thought you said you had your thoughts.
Well, as far as the heart goes, I mean, I've thought about it much more with later German mystical texts, and thinking about it through the kind of dogmatic anthropology that I've encountered in my own tradition. It seems to me to be a kind of prior category to certain kinds of anthropological distinctions, which becomes a seat of unity for the journey into God. But as far as, emotions and how it goes with trauma studies, I was thinking about the particular therapeutic modality of internal family systems, and the way that what that is doing and taking from family system therapy is witnessing to the emotion and acknowledging, okay, you walk into the living room of your mind, and who is sitting there? Well, you have maybe an angry part, And that part is also you, but you are not identical to it. And so being able to give a witness to it, what the therapeutic theory says in IFS is, well, it's there for a reason, it's developed. And maybe what it's doing is quite destructive, and that's not favorable, and you need to keep it in check. But rather than suppressing it, what you do by witnessing it is understand what its motivations are. And then you acknowledge that, as you said, it's a moment where you recognize that it's broken.
Yeah, yeah.
And then anger may not be the way to repair it, but you must first witness to the anger to recognize that.
Yeah.
So those are the ways I was going. Obviously, Augustine is not doing IFS, but
Yeah, so the interesting thing to take from your answer is you talked about prior categories. And I think, obviously we all have to use prior categories to some degree to communicate at all. But I think actually Augustine's very suspicious of prior categories. It's part of this restlessness. It's part of this constant questioning. It's one of the reasons he appeals so much to Derrida. The degree to which the boundaries of any assumption and any definition are actually amazingly fluid. Even let's go back to that prayer to God at the beginning of the Confessions, that, Confessions 1:4, that entire prayer in paradox. You couldn't pray that if you dealt with prior categories, including, incidentally, you're angry and you're tranquil says. So that's the thing, if I may, that I would take away from your answer, but I can't answer about the heart specifically, I'm afraid. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more. Kit, did you have a question?
Well, it was kind of related to the question here where in chapter 1, he says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so he's kind of referring to the heart in that very chapter, which I thought was what you were referring to, just to kind of make it explicit. But then the restlessness also ties into the turbulence that you mentioned before of wanting to remove things that are impediments. And one of the things that I thought of is perhaps there any sense that wanting to remove an impediment is almost not understanding the thing that's in your way, almost as like a gift from God. I think of Gillian Rose, who says, keep your mind in hell and despair not, or Dante, who says, just you have to go through hell in order to get out of it. Do you feel like this is kind of resonates with Augustine, or does it kind of push against him?
It's a really interesting point. I read about Gillian Rose. Thank you. I think there are impediments that he does experience as ways that bring him closer to God, as it were. And then there are the ones that are just ineluctably in the way. I think there are both types, and I'm not sure he would describe the first type as an impediment. Though that's an unsubstantiated. I can't point to specific passages where he uses a different word for something that is difficult at the time, but nonetheless brings him closer to God. But I think that's in part what the early books of City of God are about, isn't it? Not him personally, but more generally. So I would say that it's another sort of impediment that's really the one he butts up against. Yeah, but thank you for that.
Well, friends, I said that the question that's been haunting me here is who and what do we have to become so as to know and to love? And I can't imagine a deeper and better contribution to bring us all together around. So will you join me in thanking God?